Nobody posts these cars on Instagram. Nobody turns around to look at them in parking lots. Nobody says, "You got to see what I drive." And yet, these are the cars that refuse to leave people's lives. They don't get traded in. They don't get upgraded. They don't get replaced when the payment book ends. They just stay. I started noticing this pattern in the least glamorous places possible. Service waiting rooms, grocery store lots, neighborhoods where the same car is parked in the same spot year after year. Not because people couldn't afford better, because they didn't feel a reason to. These aren't cars people fall in love with on day one. They're cars people quietly commit to over time. And that distinction matters more than most buyers realize, because the cars that last aren't the ones that impress early. They're the ones that stop demanding attention altogether. Let's start with a car that almost nobody brags about, and almost nobody sells once they own it. The asterisk Toyota Camry, especially the unexciting trims nobody talks about. Not the TRD, not the flashy packages, just a regular four-cylinder Camry. On paper, it's forgettable. On the road, it disappears. And that's exactly why it stays. I've spoken to owners who've driven the same Camry for 15 years and couldn't tell you much about it, which is the highest compliment a daily driver can receive. Oil changes, tires, brakes. That's the story. The engine never becomes a conversation. The transmission never becomes a concern. The car never teaches you a lesson. People don't keep Camrys because they're exciting. They keep them because nothing ever interrupts their life. The moment a car stops interrupting you, it earns longevity. Now move slightly upmarket, but not upward in flash. The asterisk Lexus RX, particularly older, naturally aspirated generations. This is where people misunderstand loyalty. RX owners don't feel attached to the brand. They feel attached to normalcy. The RX is one of those vehicles where years pass faster than expected. Ownership doesn't leave marks. There's no defining era of problems, no point where the car suddenly feels old. I've seen RXs with 180,000 miles that still feel emotionally neutral, and that's rare. Neutrality usually fades. What keeps people in these isn't luxury, it's the absence of drama. No turbo anxiety, no software surprises, no experimental tech aging in public. When owners finally replace an RX, it's usually not because the car failed, it's because life changed. More kids, different commute, downsizing. The car didn't get rejected. It simply got outgrown. That's a very different ending. Now, here's one that surprises people when they think about it long enough. The asterisk Honda CR-V. Asterisk H, the older, simpler years. Nobody dreams about owning one. Nobody feels proud buying one. And yet, they end up everywhere. The CR-V has this strange ability to blend into people's routines so completely that they forget to shop again. It handles neglect gracefully. Missed maintenance doesn't immediately punish you. Wear happens slowly. Owners talk about these cars the same way they talk about an old jacket. Not stylish, not exciting, but perfectly shaped to their life. That's not an accident. Honda engineered these to tolerate inconsistency. Short trips, cold starts, long gaps between services. It doesn't reward perfection, it tolerates imperfection. Cars that tolerate imperfect owners survive longer. That's why CR-Vs get passed down. That's why people say, "I'll just keep it another year for a decade." Now let's talk about a brand that used to be mocked for being boring, asterisk Mazda, specifically the asterisk Mazda6 and older asterisk CX-5 generations. These are the cars people buy reluctantly and then never replace. Mazda figured something out quietly while everyone else chased tech headlines. They kept engines simple, transmissions traditional, interiors solid without being fragile. Mazdas age like appliances, not gadgets. And that matters. I've talked to owners who expected to trade their Mazda in after 3 years, and then just didn't. Not because it was perfect, but because nothing ever pushed them away. No creeping rattles, no infotainment resentment, no repair moments that feel personal. The car never tries to impress you. It just behaves, and behavior builds trust faster than performance. Then there's the asterisk Toyota 4Runner, which is a special case because it doesn't pretend to evolve. This is one of the last vehicles that refuses to modernize at the pace everyone else does. And while reviewers criticize it endlessly, owners don't care. Because the people who buy Forerunners aren't optimizing. They're committing. They know exactly what they're getting and exactly what they're not. No cutting-edge efficiency. No clever engineering tricks. No fragile systems pretending to be innovation. Just a drivetrain that's been alive longer than most competitors' design cycles. That's why these things don't leave families. They don't get traded. They get inherited. People don't keep Forerunners because they love driving them. They keep them because they never doubt them. Doubt is what kills ownership. And the cars on this list share one critical trait. They never plant doubt. They don't scare owners with uncertainty. They don't ask for interpretation. They don't force people to learn new systems just to exist. They fade. And fading is the highest achievement a car can reach. Because once a car fades into your life, replacing it feels unnecessary. And that's where things get even more interesting. Because there are a few more cars that don't just fade, they anchor people. Not because they're exciting, but because removing them feels like risk. That's where this list gets uncomfortable. That feeling, removing them feels like risk, is where loyalty stops being emotional and starts being practical. Because once a car proves it can survive neglect, routine abuse, weather, and time without turning ownership into a project, people stop asking what's newer. They start asking what's safer to keep. That's why the next cars on this list don't just linger, they anchor. Take the asterisk Toyota Corolla Ask, especially the plain trims nobody remembers the year of. This might be the least flex-worthy car in America. No presence, no statement, no personality to argue about. And that's exactly why people never get rid of them. Corollas don't age in chapters. There's no "this is when things started going downhill." The car just continues. Mileage climbs quietly. Interior wears evenly. The drivetrain never announces itself. I've seen Corollas with body panels mismatched, interiors sun-faded, maintenance done inconsistently. And they still start every morning like they don't know what abuse is. Owners don't talk about them because there's nothing to report, and silence is the real metric of success. People think reliability means doesn't break. What it really means is doesn't require relationship. Corollas don't need to be understood. They don't need forgiveness. They don't need patience. They just exist. Now move into something that surprises people when they see how long it stays around. The asterisk Subaru Outback asterisk, particularly the middle generation models before everything became overcomplicated. Subaru owners are loyal in a very specific way. They don't defend the brand loudly. They justify it quietly. What keeps Outbacks around isn't perfection. It's predictability. All-wheel drive that behaves the same every winter. Suspension that tolerates bad roads. Engines that don't feel stressed doing ordinary things. Older Outbacks weren't fast. They weren't refined, but they were honest. Owners knew what the car could and couldn't do, and that clarity matters more than capability. Once a vehicle becomes predictable, people stop shopping. That's why Outbacks stick around even when owners complain about them. Complaining doesn't mean leaving. It means familiarity. Then there's a car people forget exists until they notice how many are still on the road. The asterisk Toyota Avalon asterisk. This is where the nobody flexes theme becomes obvious. Avalons don't age in public. They age privately. Big naturally aspirated engines. Soft suspensions. Conservative tuning. Interiors built for comfort instead of admiration. People who buy Avalons don't replace them because the replacement feels like a downgrade in peace. The car doesn't surprise you with noise. It doesn't punish you for mileage. It doesn't introduce new quirks as it ages. I've met owners who say things like, "I keep thinking I should replace it, but I don't know what I'd gain." That's the trap. When a car removes urgency, it traps you in contentment. And contentment doesn't drive sales. Which brings us to one of the most misunderstood long-term keepers, the asterisk older Honda Accord asterisk. Especially naturally aspirated years before turbo everything. These cars aren't exciting. They're reassuring. Accords have this way of aging that feels cooperative. They don't fight time. They work with it. Suspension softens slightly. Steering loosens a touch, but nothing collapses. Owners keep them because the car doesn't suddenly demand to be replaced. It just becomes familiar, like a well-worn tool that still works exactly as expected. And here's the key difference between cars people keep and cars people abandon. Cars people abandon force decisions. Cars people keep remove them. That's the dividing line. It's not about horsepower. It's not about features. It's not even about brand prestige. It's about whether the car ever makes you stop and think, is this worth it anymore? Every vehicle on this list avoids that moment. Not because they're flawless, but because their flaws don't escalate. They don't turn small annoyances into long-term stress. And that's why these cars never get flexed. Flexing is for cars that demand attention. Keeping is for cars that give you your attention back. People don't show these cars off because there's nothing to prove. Ownership already proved itself. That's also why these vehicles don't trend. They don't spike in popularity. They don't get rediscovered. They just persist. And persistence doesn't photograph well. But if you watch driveways instead of feeds, if you pay attention to what doesn't move year after year, you start seeing the pattern clearly. The cars that last aren't exciting. They're dependable in the most boring way possible. They don't create stories. They prevent them. And once you've owned a car that never turns into a story, everything else starts feeling risky. That's why these cars don't leave. Not because people can't afford something better, but because better isn't always louder, faster, or newer. Sometimes better is just the car that never gives you a reason to think about it again. And once you've lived with that kind of ownership, flexing feels pointless. You keep the car and move on with your life. That's the quiet win nobody posts about.